Welcome everyone to the Serious Leisure podcast. My name is Petya Petrova. I'm your host for today's podcast. I'm joined by our regular podcast contributors, Dr. Sam Elkington and Kat Branch. Sam is from Teesside University. He's our Serious Leisure expert. Welcome, Sam.
Thanks, Petya. Great to be here as always.
Great to have you, Sam. Kat leads the University of the West of England Centre for Music. Welcome, Kat.
Hi, Petya. Great to see you.
Great to see you too on this somewhat windy day. We often refer to the University of the West of England as UWE. In this podcast, we share stories about our leisure pursuits, our passions, our hobbies and interests. We reflect on our attempts to successfully, or not so successfully, balance work and leisure time. And we draw on insights from the serious leisure perspective and the vast literature on it. We're very excited to welcome today our two guests. Louise Mighall is a colleague of mine at the Academic Practice Directorate here at UWE. She's Senior Administrator and Office Manager. Welcome, Louise.
Hi, Petya.
Hi. Louise is joined by Dr. Arthur Turner. Arthur works as a senior lecturer in the Organizational Studies cluster at the Faculty of Business and Law. Welcome, Arthur.
Thanks very much.
Hi, Arthur. Before we delve into Arthur and Louise's serious leisure pursuits, let us find out a little about your professional roles. Can you please introduce yourselves to our listeners and tell us something about your role and what it involves? Let's start with Louise. Louise, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at the Academic Practice Directorate?
Hello, thank you, Petya. As you've already said, I work within the Academic Practice Directorate at UWE, and I'm part of the team primarily working on the administration and design of UWE's Festival of Learning. I have also recently taken on the Senior Administrator and Office Manager role as part of a job share, whilst one of our colleagues is on secondment. This has increased my involvement in the administration of the Introduction to Teaching and Learning and Programme Leader and Module Leader workshops with Petya. And what's brought me here today is my passion for creating a positive environment for bees and other insects using the outdoor space available to us.
Thanks, Louise. And as with all other guests, there's so much more to talk about what Louise does, but we're not here to talk about that. Arthur, can you tell us about your day job, please?
Yeah, delighted to. I am a senior lecturer in the Organisational Studies cluster, and I specialise in coaching and mentoring, the vocational qualifications that from ILM, and I also do a little bit of lecturing around creativity and learning, sort of adult learning and art and things like that. And that's usually how I spend my time.
Thanks, Arthur. We can spend hours talking about Arthur's work around creativity and learning, but we are not here to talk about that. We are here to talk about your stories about engaging with nature. I'm really excited about this conversation today because your stories are so uniquely different in some ways and yet so similar. So let's start with what it is that your hobby is, where it started, and where we currently find you. Louise, can you tell us about your story?
Thank you. Yes, of course. It's been quite a gradual story, really. I've always had an interest in wildlife and the world around us and where we live, and is within part of that. And my mum's always been interested in horticulture. My dad was always really interested in the outside and being in the garden. And I finally got access to a garden myself within the last few years. And I've had 2 young boys, and I've just wanted to create a positive environment for bees and other insects, and actually just enjoy the outdoor space and the outdoor environment that you have, whether it be a window box, a balcony, or as we've recently been able to get to know our garden and develop that. It's also nice to be able to try and inspire an interest for our 2 young children about gardening and getting involved within nature. and being able for them to feel that they can have a positive impact, however small it is, with something just outside their door. So we work together, we make bug hotels, they're planting bulbs and plants, and we're really trying to get them to feel connected with the world around them, whether it be different creatures that are outside, spiders, wood lice, and knowing that every single one is important and how they can help the ecosystems outside thrive. And then it was my son over lockdown and realised how happy and relaxed I was in the garden, and said, if you're really happy and relaxed outside gardening, then why don't you do it as a job? And I was just explaining to him that I love that aspect to be brought into my working life, but I do have a job that I enjoy, and he just said, well, just go out and just make a change if you want to have a change. So he inspired me, and I just drew up some flyers, and been lucky enough to be invited now into other people's gardens to talk about their green spaces and what they can do to positively impact their own green spaces, so that we can try and support the bees and insects around us.
Thanks, Louise. So we are starting with a discussion about a young family, and now we are moving to Arthur's story around his engagement with nature, where it started, how it went, and where it's currently going. Arthur.
Yeah, thank you. Just funny listening to Louise and remembering my own dad was very much a kind of a countryman, and used to take me along the river, and he was able to describe to me the flowers and what they were called. So I think that's probably where it comes from, my interest in nature. When my mother died about 10 years ago, she left me a little bit of money, and I extravagantly bought a camera, and for no particular reason other than the ones I had weren't very good. And I started to wander around my garden and started to take photos. And in those days, sounds ages ago, but in those days you send off your film to be processed. And so it was often a bit of a wait. And when they came back, I would say, well, I didn't know I took that. I didn't recognize that thing. I thought it was a bee. Oh, it's a hoverfly, or it's some other unidentified insect. And it led me to be, not obsessionally, of course, but when spring came and summer came, I would wander around the garden, not gardening, but looking at the insects. And I did become very interested in hoverflies, and discovered through a big textbook that I bought that there were hundreds of species of hoverflies, all different colours and different behaviours. Oh, this is good. And then on a BBC programme, I heard about solitary bees, which gave rise to the joke that I didn't know they were alone. But, I suddenly realised there were hundreds of species of bees as well. And that led me to a place where I started to see them better. I think they were always there, but I suddenly started to see these creatures buzzing around my garden, and I started to plant things that might attract them a bit more easily, which has led me to an association, I guess, with a bit of wildland in the city of Newport, which has been long neglected by humans, which is probably a good thing, and to start thinking about restoring it, because it's had years of invasive plants. So these invasive plants are on the retreat through council spraying and what have you, because they have to do legally. And it's exposed a broad swathe of land that has a huge population. We did a survey in the first 6 months last year and found 320 species of insects. Now, this was a place that was supposed to be, abandoned and like rubbish ground. And it really made me interested in the whole thing about solitary bees, plus the ecology of the area in which I live.
Thanks, Arthur. So thank you both for giving us an overview of what we're talking about. I would start firstly with a question about neighbours. Because I think, Louise, you talked about your engagement with nature started with the family and the boys in your garden, and then suddenly it expanded outwards into other people's gardens. Can you just tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yes, of course. It was it was quite a daunting thing to start with, really. Not necessarily about, you know, the neighbours I was going to see, but the concept of actually stepping outside of your own sort of comfort zone, and your own comfort zone in your sort of your own area, and actually stepping into somebody else's comfort zone and their space, and being able to get to know like my neighbours on a different level, rather just a bit sort of bit more involved than obviously saying good morning every day. Actually going over to speak to them about what their interests are and how they like to be within their own space and what they would like to get out of it, whether it's just help with the maintenance because it's aspects of some of the work that they can no longer do now, which is sad, which was in some instances I found it was quite hard for them to have me there. Because there are sometimes it was for me helping with the maintenance, and also it was helping to look at their pots and plants and planters and just see what we can do together following their lead as to how they would like to transform their garden, and for me to try and help bring their image of what they would like to life, but also talking about the different subtle ways that we can help encourage, you know, the insects and the bees. And it was about not using pesticide. It was like it's simple sort of subtle changes that could be used within their gardens, and just getting to know who they were and who they are, and respecting the fact that each person's own space is really important to them, and be mindful that you don't want to come in and take over, because they also would like, and the same way I would like, is to still be actively involved within that space. You don't want that interaction to be taken away, because it's therapeutic in itself. It's important to actually physically be connected with your environment. So it's just a case of going out and being invited into neighbours' homes and helping see where I can support and guide where necessary and where that was wanted. It really has helped me feel even more connected to the area that I'm living in, and it's made me feel more connected to those that are around me.
Louise, I'm really struck by your social tenacity in doing that. You know, within British culture, to kind of fly at your neighbours and say, hey, shall I come round to your garden? This is very impressive. We're not living in Spain here. I wonder, did you feel like you needed to have a certain level of knowledge about what you were doing, or did you just kind of courageously get out there and go, well, I'm finding my way, shall I come and find my way in your garden? I'm just so interested in where you got that impetus and that bravery.
Yeah, it was basically thinking the flowers have survived in my garden for a number of years and I've been able to see them grow. We live in the same area, so maybe in terms of the weather and climate, you've got to think about the different types of soil and everything. But I thought, well, it can't be too drastically different from my own. And it was a case of trusting that something was working positively for me, and there is no reason why, on a very basic level here, it could work for somebody else. And I just had to have that belief that not everybody needs an expert to come in, to have someone that can come and just talk through your needs and wants for your garden and your space, and to help work together in those areas really, and support. And it's worked really nicely. A lot of it though, it was my son who did actually say, come on mum, you can change, you can make a change. And I was using this as an example of the fact that I can stand up, I can put some flyers together, and I can, respectively British in a way, saying, you know, just knocking on the door and putting the flyer through. I didn't go any further than that, and then waited for those that were interested and to call, and that was really nice. But I did hand deliver the flyers going around, so those that I did speak to, it was nice to have that one-on-one conversation and a get to know really. It's like, hello, I'm hopefully your friendly neighbourly gardener who can come over and support in areas that you may feel that you need. And I just came with my own sort of ethos really.
Love it. I love it. I love that you didn't feel like you had to be, you know, world's best gardener before you made this endeavour. And I feel sure that from what you described, even that kind of that philosophy of not everyone needs an expert would have made those conversations so much easier. The way you're describing them, I'm just imagining this really kind of nice neighbourly interaction where that community is kind of building and you just live there and they live there, and rather than you're swooping in with your extraordinary expertise to fix their gardening woes. There's a really nice kind of peer type aspect to it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, to be fair, I have been gifted a few books along the way, and I have done enough sort of. It was not necessarily research to actually start this new endeavour. It was actually research for myself and my family to actually get to know the space that we've got. So I have spent quite a few years reading up, looking at different plants, looking at the way certain soil interacts with different planting and different times of the year to plant certain bulbs, and which ones are safe to have even with children and pets. And it was all of that in all of the sort of the book work I was using to actually get to know my own personal space, and because I saw those aspects really develop and start working, I was able to actually be a bit more confident knowing that I potentially have something I can share. But I also am very, very careful. I'm very careful with what I say, and I will always go around identifying plants with different apps in gardens to make sure that I'm very respectful and very careful that when I'm reaching out of something that I've read and researched, then I actually will take that away, do some research, come back, and we'll have further conversations about it.
Brilliant, Louise. Thank you for describing that interesting process. I wonder, Arthur, could you tell us a bit about what your whole journey from zero to whatever your knowledge is now, and maybe also about, as well as alongside your research experience and how you've gone about that. I'd be interested to hear also about the social dynamics in comparison with Louise's journey. Could you fill us in?
No, it's okay. I'm here. I think that the interesting thing is, well, hopefully it's interesting, that I studied botany when I was younger, and in a way I already had a kind of core knowledge borrowed from my father in particular. And it's only recently when I realised that some of the things you don't obviously see. So it's easy to know about birds and trees because they're big often and they're in front of you. But bees and insects are much more difficult. I mean, they don't hang around often. They buzz off, as it were, And so the camera plus the photos, plus, of course, then my mobile phone, which gave me a chance to identify, but also enlarge the photographs I was taking, enabled me to begin to build up a kind of bank of knowledge around. Initially, it was what they were called in common terms. More recently, it's I've even learned some of the Latin names to try and be a bit more scientific. I know, ooh la la, to be a bit more scientific about it. And I've noticed that's interesting that my link to other people. So I really recognise what Louise said. What I started to do was kind of bump into people, and there was it really started with me almost invading someone's garden, and this was a neighbour I didn't know, and his reaction was quite odd in some ways, because he came out with his wife and said in that tone of voice, "What are you doing?" And I wasn't actually in the garden. I mean, I made an excuse that I was only leaning into his garden, so it was kind of all right. But within 5 or 10 minutes, he was telling me how much he really liked moths, and how the moths of the local area gathered on his wall in the morning, and he had thousands of photos. But he said that he'd never spoken to anybody other than his wife about that, and it struck me as being how kind of ignorant, I guess, you can be when you view yourself just as a person living in society. It didn't really matter who your neighbours were. So in a way, it really expanded my knowledge of who was who and what they were interested in by having a conversation about. And so he said, "Oh, so do you know about these bees then?" And I said, "Well, I know a little bit." And although we don't meet much, and COVID and other things have prevented lots of face-to-face meetings, the magic of the digital world means that he takes a photo and sends me it, and says, what do you think this is? So we're building our knowledge together. And this is not just one person. That's about 3 or 4 people within about, in old terms, 100 yards, 100 meters or so of my house. Now, these are people I didn't even send a Christmas card to. And so that society and my understanding, and I think one of the things I reflected on was the kind of the ecology of the bees. So they weren't actually solitary bees in many ways. They were connected to all sorts of things, flowers and other insects. Replicated what I was endeavouring to find out about the ecology of the community, you know, the links between people and who knew who and what they were like and so on, which it was a journey that I hadn't predicted that I would take. So that was really interesting, the kind of echoes that I got. And the final echo I got, which was, again, took me back to someone I used to know 50 years ago, who used to send me a Christmas card every year. That's what you got, a Christmas card. And but she was an artist, and she started to use her own paintings for the Christmas card. And I hadn't really spoken to her for 50 years, other than the Christmas card. And she sent me a nice card with a song thrush on the cover, with a little bee next to it, just as an adornment to the picture. And so I did have a phone number. I phoned her up. And it was amazing how much she knew about what I didn't know. You know, so she knew about bees, and she knew about gardens. And her garden is fantastic. And since that time, so that's about 2 years, I've also been in contact almost every day. We speak or something like that. And that increases. So it's not just now, it's not just my neighbours now, it's other people who'd been neighbourly even 50 years ago.
Thanks, Arthur. Louise, you want to come in here?
Well, I just wanted to just say I just find it wonderful how you can, yourself and also anyone who takes an interest in something outside your day-to-day routines, and you're finding a fascination with a particular insect or it could be anything, and that interest develops, and the connections. It's like the link between sort of the connection between the natural world, which is extensive, and it's to such extent that there's much of it we still don't really understand or know, but using those connections to naturally just evolve your community interactions, interactions and conversations with friends over the years. I just think it's wonderful. There's so much extra life out there, and interactions and enjoyment and conversations that can develop through something so simple and natural and beautiful as a bee on a Christmas card, and suddenly you're able to foster more conversations. And it just feels very much like that with I noticed something very similar when I've started getting a bit more involved. I'm suddenly finding more interest with people I didn't really share that information with before, and it's brings a lot of extra positivity, I suppose.
Thanks, Louise. Arthur?
Yes, it struck me that one of the things that I reflected on just as you were talking was what I do in my day job, as it were. There are two really, and they're two philosophical things really about the teaching of coaching, particularly around leadership. I mean, one's about sort of human agency, and the skills of coaching are there really primarily to give people license to know what they want to do and find ways of doing it rather than being told. And there's the other thing that I really like, and I've spent quite a few years trying to pronounce this, the philosophy of phenomenology. I think I did it quite well then. Heidegger's work in the 1930s and things, where he talked about, and other disciples of his, talked about kind of emergence. And one thing is I noticed it's not black and white, you know, the whole process of getting into nature, being with, identifying bees, noticing bee parasites, all sorts of things like that. I can't do that in this moment. That it has to emerge through, and it emerges more quickly because I'm now connected to an older neighbour who's a fungal expert. I had no idea about that. Another younger guy who's an ecologist. I had no idea about that either. And so we're now having conversations where we're beginning to fill each other's gaps in. which I think is also a very interesting, like a mosaic, whereas we all have fragmented knowledge. And in the community, therefore, we're almost painting a picture, filling it in somehow, making it more colourful, making it more visible, I guess, rather than seeing it just as a solitary bee on a solitary daisy.
Where do I start is my question. There's so, and in actual fact, you two can just crack on, because you're playing off each other really, really nicely here in terms of that shared experience. But in terms of, you know, this whole idea of serious leisure, and you obviously are very serious about this. And I love the fact that Arthur's gone down the phenomenology route. Don't get me started on that. But the idea of emergence, I think, is something I'd actually written down. You know, this whole idea of, actually my thought process went to emergent motivation, in the sense that, you know, you always start something that you end up being quite committed to by just trying it out or exploring and doing little bits and pieces. And you, in the doing of that, you find more and more connection or more interest, and it grows from there. So that emergent, and you can hear it in both of your stories. Actually, you both mentioned the idea of journey, and you're on a journey of exploration and all of those kind of things. But from a serious leisure perspective, I guess, you know, there's certainly, you know, the hobbyist or hobbyists in you is fairly obvious and stark in terms of how you're talking, but this whole idea of nature appreciation, and there's a couple of different permutations of kind of hobbyist nature, but certainly nature appreciation is the one I think fits most authentically to your stories. You know, this idea of connection with the natural world, the beauty of the natural world, appreciation of that flora and fauna, all of these things. And actually, a question I was going to ask, but you've kind of already answered it, both of you together, is the social aspect of it. You know, and just as a caveat, my parents are seriously avid gardeners, and are quite protective over their space. They have a lovely garden, cottage garden down in Leicestershire, and are pretty much self-sufficient. You know, they've got a garden, a cottage garden, and then they have an allotment essentially at the bottom of the garden, and it's what they love to do. They're both retired, and you know, they're very, you know, they have their time evolves around the jobs they have to do in the garden. You know, and I think but they've only started to recently opening up to the Village Garden Show. Now, we haven't got time to go into it, but there's a whole story about this. But it really chimes with Louise, what you were saying about the connection. And actually, Arthur, it comes through in what you're saying as well. The connections that we have through our natural spaces. You know, when you think about it and you take everything else out of it, it's the only thing that connects us. And it's, you know, what I'm hearing in what both of you are saying is, you know, it's about paying attention to those spaces. You know, and you've actually used the word space and place interchangeably, which I love as well, because, you know, place is space imbued with meaning, and I think that's certainly coming through here. But how much of this is about being in the space, and how much of it is about? Because also what I'm hearing is there's a lot of learning going on. Yeah, there's a learning, intrinsic to what you guys are talking about here. You can hear it. I love the idea of a mosaic of knowledge. Yeah, it's what we do, but it's through the social context and social context, you're building that mosaic. It wouldn't happen otherwise. And the common denominator is natural space. So I wondered if you could comment. Yes, Arthur, if you could comment.
As part of this extended, almost a job, I don't think it's quite a job, this piece of land that's behind the army barracks, which overviews the city centre. The ecologist friend and I, we decided to make a little group. So we call ourselves the Nature Restoration Group. And it was partly to be because the council said that we weren't prepared to give you insurance for us to work on it. So we had contact with the council. We made this group, and we used the Welsh name Atump, which means land with lots of vegetation in. Often Welsh is longer words, much longer words, but this time Atump means that. And so my friend and I, who's an ecologist, he said, I know a bit about land restoration. And I bought a book and looked it up. And we now go over a couple of times a week with our rakes and our secateurs and things like that to begin the process of restoring nature. So part of it is removing alien species like Japanese knotweed and the dead stems. Partly it's to do with sycamore trees, and if you know about sycamore trees, they're not native and they are very invasive themselves. And so we removed about 150 saplings of sycamore that were sprouting in the area. And just that act of working with this guy who I didn't know, who's 20 years younger than me. So it's a nice little intergenerational contact. But the land is backs onto the huge sort of 15-foot wall of the barracks. And there's a path that's regularly used, but not very often used, a sort of windy, muddy path where dog walkers come. And one of the things that seems to happen while we're in that space, people often come over with their dogs and say, "Oh, hi, how are you doing?" And we've met 4 or 5 people who are very interested in what we're doing. Some of them got history. So some of them say, "Oh, yeah, there used to be rabbits here," or "Did you see the sparrowhawk last week?" So they're giving us information sort of like scouts. Some people are sort of vaguely interested. I'm pleased somebody's doing something with this rubbish land. We've had a few comments like that. And getting to know people in the local area is about noticing the difference between those individuals. So there's a really strong feeling for not who should I meet. And you mentioned sort of like earlier, Sam, about sort of middle-class people live in middle-class areas, they meet middle-class people, but these are often people who are there's a guy, I'm sure he's a poacher, I'm absolutely sure about that, but he's got really a core bit of country knowledge. There's someone else who's really good and patient with photography who comes and just shows us stuff. I took a picture of this the other day. Are you interested in this? And some of it's quite funny as well. The one guy's got a huge dog that he constantly says is safe. And others, "No, mate, no, it's fine. The dog will be fine. And if he likes you, it's fine. If he doesn't like you, well, I'll pull him off, as it were." And this dog, I was talking to this guy about the jackdaws that live. There's a huge colony of jackdaws that live on this land or around this land. And the dog, which must have been, it's a Rottweiler, so it's massive, sat on my foot and just leaned into it. He said, "Oh, he likes you, mate. So that's all right." So there's also these sort of what are they? Just ordinary human connection with another human being that's funny. Yes, Sam.
I love that. I love, just the serendipity of that as well. It's something very natural about it. Just getting everything else out the way, and actually, it's just about human contact, really. But there's something you said, and I don't know whether it's quite as profound as I'm making it out to be, which is very often the case. But you mentioned the word noticing. And I think in this context, as we're talking, and I hear it in what Louise is saying, and Louise, you can come in a minute, and I don't know if you're going to be able to kind of build on this, but I hear it in what you're saying, Arthur, in terms of noticing not just in natural space, but actually when you're in that space, noticing others as well. So actually there's something about being in nature, which I don't know whether it lowers barriers or gives us a wider lens or just opens us up. But there's something about being able to notice more about the world around us whilst we're in nature, I think, in through what you're saying. But actually, Louise, I just wanted to pick up as well in what you were saying. It's actually your son who noticed that you had reacted this way to being in nature. So I wonder, how much of it is about that? Just noticing. Just obviously, it links out to mindfulness, and this has all been talked about before. But Louise, what do you think?
Thanks, Sam. Yes, I think it's predominantly what I think my son would have noticed is how grounded I feel being outside and in the garden, and calmer. I know you referenced like mindfulness as well. I think the whole experience of being outside and being connected to nature and having a positive impact on different things, whether it be the plants you planted are growing, that you've been trying to encourage different species into your garden and you've seen one for the first time. It's that feeling that you are actually you're positively contributing to the world around you. And for me, it's a sense of peace and grounding. and I need a lot of that. I do. I need a lot of that feeling. I need to just step away from the busy day to day, and gardening and being outside really gives me that sense of peace. And I that must come across in leaps and bounds to my children, my husband, and those around me, knowing that mum's just very content outside. And I just, that's part of the reason why I really wanted to support the boys in that, try and sort of encourage an interest. Everyone's different and everyone has their own ways and likes of what it is that they would like to do and what they find enjoyable, but to actually just sort of put them in an environment where they can see these positive things happening. It was wonderful. They've planted most of the plants in the garden. They're noticing all the different kinds of spiders we have, and it's just they're stepping out of their busy day-to-day life, which is increasingly intense for young children, and they're slowing down and they're becoming they get into the natural pace of the garden, which is an awful lot slower than the day-to-day. They react positively to that, and as Arthur mentioned as well, and Sam, about noticing people. I think when you have slowed down and you're just calmer and you're relaxing and you're enjoying what you're doing and you're connecting with it, I think your mind does open up. You're not as shut and focused on what you have to do next and when you have to do it. You've slowed down enough to have that time to lift your head up and look around and have different conversations with people. And I have found, and I've always believed this, but I found it increasingly with what I've been doing recently with the work with gardens, is that it feels like every positive interaction you can have within your community or with anybody in any way that is, can enhance that other person's day in a positive way. And I think that really shines when you're outside and you're getting involved in nature, whether especially with yourself, Arthur, you're not only getting involved in your own garden and your own space, you're actually transforming an area that everybody within your community is going to benefit from, whether they know it's there or not. You're really supporting and enhancing those around you. And I think it's fabulous what you're doing.
I'm not sure I would call it fabulous yet, but thank you for that. Two things really that struck me about this looking up business. It is too easy to particularly at the moment, to focus just on your laptop as the way you live your life. I mean, two things happened really. Is firstly, because it's on a southern slope and it's facing east, I get the sunrise. Now, I'd never really. I like skies, of course. Most people like skies, but noticing that if we were often too preoccupied to go home, so we often got the sort of sunset, or we'd hurry and say, well, before work we could do an hour or so. And looking up the skies are fantastic, and I've got now slightly obsessed by taking pictures of lovely cherry and apricot skies in the morning. The other thing that happened, and like I think Petty, you said you had a singing teacher, so have I, and I started to talk to her about it, and she was saying, "Well, why don't you do a soundscape of where you were working?" Thinking, "What? I can't do that. That's crazy. I'm nearly 70. I can't begin to do that." But there's now a little project around beginning to express the place that I like, the place I'm working in, as a kind of a cameo bit of music, like a 3 or 4 minute, I don't know what you'd call it, soundscape, I suppose is what I'm beginning to call it, because it ties in quite nicely with the idea, and I've been inspired a bit by Robert McFarlane's book about lost words, and thinking about, because one of the things that I did to try and capture some of this was write, and this is what I get people doing their coaching training doing, is to write haiku poetry, to just capture a moment, kind of a key moment in their lives or the key moment in their work as a coach before it disappears, and so I've got a series of, I haven't got many, I've got about 8 or 9 from this year where I've just come home and I just, either in my phone or on a piece of paper, scribbled a haiku. And then I thought, and my singing teacher said, well, you could read out the haiku poems with your own composed background kind of song, incantation. Thinking, what? You're talking to me? I can't do that. It's impossible. But I think I'm now beginning to think that those things I thought were, almost lost to me because I'm getting older and things, and when I get a chance to do it, and now I'm thinking, I could compose a song.
Thanks, Arthur. Kat was very excited starting this podcast, but now she's beyond herself. There's a lot of facial expressions come from her little square of her looking very excited at the kind of link of creativity kind of layered now on top of or around your interests. That's quite interesting. I'll talk about my singing lessons to our listeners some other time. And what that involves. But I was struck around the little haikus because I'm trying to get into this routine where I write 2 or 3 lines of not full sentences, not really poetry, but just something that captures the mood of the day. So a form of diary, but an emotional diary, as opposed to a diary of these are the things that happens. And it takes me maybe a minute to write. I'm not overthinking it. I'm just kind of putting a few words on a piece of paper. And I'm trying to do more and more often every night as kind of part of my mindfulness practice. And it really struck me around you capturing your emotions, which hopefully are much more positive on a daily basis, given what we're talking about, as opposed to my end of day moans to myself about life in the universe. But I just think it's so exciting that you're layering your interests, you're layering that connection with others, impact on others, connection with nature, connection with your environment, and impacting on the environment. And the same with Louise, where she's layering her connection with her family and her children, connection with her neighbours, impacting on the lives of her family and family environment, and impacting on the lives of the neighbours and the neighbouring environment. And I think that's just such a wonderful example about how with a little start somewhere, introducing something new to our lives, that can grow into something unexpected and something beautiful. Sam?
Sorry, if I don't say this, it's going to go and I'm going to think about something completely irrelevant. So I need to say it now. I think the connection is obviously there. Absolutely, it's rich, it's wonderful. It's all of the things we're describing. But I think it's a bit more than that in both cases here. I think for me, I'm thinking in terms of kind of just weaving things together, something a bit more natural, kind of a more natural kind of analogy, if you like. And I'm reminded of, I'm sorry to be the academic here, I don't want to, it's absolutely boring compared to what we're hearing here. But there's an anthropologist called Tim Ingold. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Tim Ingold's work. And he talks about the importance of knots and how actually knots are for him a way of describing, connection, density of connection, and the importance of meaningfulness that we create around certain points of connection. I can't get it out of my head as you're talking, both of you, about what you're actually doing is weaving these knots of connection, and it's a shared kind of altruistic endeavor for both of you. It's not just about it makes me feel good and therefore I'm going to keep doing it. Actually, in the act of gardening or the act of natural appreciation, you're weaving these knots of meaning and connection that are actually having an effect on other people. So it's actually, I can just see it as you're describing it. And for me, it's connection, yes, but actually it's more about what the knots represent. So all those conversations, Arthur, that you've had, or you've reached out to people that you have a connection with, even via a Christmas card, but you've reached out and you've had a conversation. It's become a more meaningful relationship through that, and the connection is nature. And I just wanted to make that observation. It's something that in my head, I was starting to see, it's a weaving of connection as opposed to just connecting with through space. So that I'm going to shut up.
Thanks, Sam. You don't need to shut up. It was a really interesting point. And Arthur was nodding at you, reference to yet another piece of academic writing. I just want to attend slightly to a small logistical point, but the point I find really intriguing. And that is that when we talk to you about your stories, they all bloomed, pun intended, as COVID was starting. And we often talk about COVID being difficult to really understate what we've all experienced and the trauma and suffering that many of our listeners may have gone through in the last couple of years. But for you, COVID provided an opening. There was an opening through the push of a kind of neighbours and friends and children, but there was an opening that COVID provided in the kind of stopping that we all had to experience, particularly around the first lockdown. And I really want to unpack that a little bit. Louise, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, thanks, Katia. I think with the lockdowns, obviously, it completely altered your day-to-day and your being and your perspective on what was important and what you'd actually like to do with the time. I don't really want to say gift of time, because I don't think that's quite appropriate, but it was the fact that as a unit we stopped, we totally slowed down and we stopped. We were in a position, we were in a fortunate position where we could work from home mostly, and the boys were at home, and we slowed down, and within that slowing down the pace of life changed, and we were able to spend more time with each other and noticing each other in a much more sort of positive and broader way, and having the ability to be able to step out into our garden, which I know we were very fortunate to be able to do. We had to step out into the garden, and we were for the first time able to go out each morning and see how much a bulb had grown. I couldn't believe it. I was talking to my husband and the boys, and I'd be going out and I'd be looking at the garden thinking, goodness, we've had rain, we've had sun, I should be seeing them by now. I planted them 2 months ago. Where are they? And I was noticing the tiny changes over a very long period of time, a longer period of time than I normally would have spent focusing on it. And it was extraordinary, the changes within that time, and actually noticing how the environment changes over that year. And it's slightly different now, also back to work, but I'm still noticing these things, but in less consistent points. Effectively it's just it has shifted the focus, and given us the opportunity to ignite an interest and actually feel that you need to prioritize little snippets of life that make you feel better as a person and contribute positively to your life and of those around you and for those around you, and that's what the garden has done for us. And also our walk down to the local our local sort of like park and nature reserve bit we've got down by the end of our house. That was our one walk a day, and the boys loved it, and they were noticing different animals and creatures, and they were suddenly their tiny little bit of the world started opening up for them. And it's something that we've tried to keep going forward rather than revert entirely back to how we were prior to the start of COVID.
Thanks, Louise. Just so that to help our audience imagine things, because I'm listening to you and it sounds like you have this magical garden that is kind of expansive and that you spend a lot of time in. Can you just give our audience a context about the size of your garden, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I live in a tiny old 2 up, 2 down terrace, old coal mining terrace in Bristol, and it's lovely. I love it. It's our little bolt hole, and we've got a very small garden out the back. We're very lucky. It's south facing, so we are very, very lucky with that. But it's a little square of lawn, effectively, which I dug borders in. And my husband knows this now because I did let him know what I was doing each year. When we first moved in, we had to completely change it. There was no lawn. It was just sort of bark everywhere. So we got rid of all of that, put a lawn down, and I had to negotiate the borders. And I was trying to explain to Scott, I said, I've wasted my whole life to be able to have a space that I can actually grow some plants. So I do need some borders, because my husband was completely validly trying to get as much space for the boys to play as possible. So they started off with a foot, and each year I've dug them. Each year they've gone about sort of like a few inches in. So now so by stealth. So I've got these slightly bigger borders now, which I can develop and actually have some depth to. But I mean, we're talking in about half a metre, I'd say. So, and a small bit of grass, and lots of pots, and a little bit of a terrace above a garage that is also full of pots, and it's where we grow all of our veg over lockdown. So I've got a tiny little space, but we just try and do the best we can with it, and introduce window boxes to the front of the house, which I'm very proud to say it was the first on our street, actually, because when I first put them out, all of our neighbours were saying they're going to get stolen, and I said, well, I hope not, but if they do, then someone else can enjoy them. And it was a window tray that we had in the garden when we moved in, and some flowers that we'd grown from seeds. I mean, it wasn't I didn't spend an awful lot of money on these window boxes, so I thought if they go, they go. But they've never been stolen, and we're slowly getting more down the road, which I'm really pleased about. So yes, it's just tiny space, but we love it very much.
Thanks, Louise. Can I just ask one more question about you? You built such a beautiful picture of your garden and your house. Can you just tell us how old your boys are?
Yes, of course, they're 7 and 4, but soon to be 5 tomorrow, actually, so 7 and 5.
Okay, well, happy birthday for tomorrow. Kat?
I was just going to say, Louise, that I've just found listening to you and Arthur actually wonderfully reassuring and inspiring. You know, my garden, we live in a semi, and my boys are 7 and 10. And my garden has patches where I really try and give it some love, you know, and I really love being out there. And that first lockdown we experienced, I really connected to what you were describing, Louise, about going outside and actually making contact with what was happening in the space. And we planted some bulbs and things like that. We planted some herbs as well. My younger boy grew a chili plant from scratch over a year in that time. But since we've gone back into a more, you know, normal rhythm, if I could put it like that, where I'm back at work full time all the time, and having all the more normal demands, I've completely lost contact with this, actually. I was feeling really emotional as you were talking. It's just like, oh no, I'm missing out. There's this thing that I was doing, and actually we were really enjoying that as a family. And it's really nice to hear that actually it doesn't have to be fantastic. It doesn't have to be an enormous project. Sometimes I'm concerned that I think, well, if I'm not going to do it properly, then there's not much point starting, is there? If you're not going to do it well, you know, that whole philosophy. But actually this kind of seedling analogy that both you and Arthur have talked about, where you just sort of start. And here I'm using the seed as a metaphor. So you're kind of going, okay, fine, let's just do it. I'm putting it in, the soil's going on, let's see what happens. Rather than thinking, well, I have to have all my knowledge mapped out. And in my case, I look at my garden and think, I must have a plan. I must have a goal. I must have an idea of how it's going to work. And I was just thinking about how your borders have slowly inched out, you know, making more space, but not necessarily through the force of your goal setting, but just through that much more gentle and organic process of planting and seeing what's happening, and then they get a bit bigger. It was just very moving and actually made it seem wonderfully accessible again. And I realised I've made a boundary in my mind of going, well, if you can't do it properly, then forget it. And I'm listening to you and realising this is complete nonsense. And by keeping that attitude going, I'm kind of denying that joy that I found with the family back then. So thank you for how you've described that. I wonder, Louise, did you want to respond? Because I know I could see you nodding while I was talking.
I just wanted to say I'm so pleased that this has been it's been a positive conversation for you in your garden. And I must admit, honestly, I've had the same battles with working sort of like with my neighbours and working in the garden, and then going back to work full time. Our garden at the moment, everything needs doing. I mean, the algae's coming back on the walls. Everything is doing. All of the stems from the bulbs from the summer sort of like are over now. I'm using that as an excuse is like they're going to protect them from growing up, and they're like mulch now, so that's actually good for the garden. So it's there's times of the year when things are coming to life and they're full of vibrancy and it's amazing, and there are other times when it just looks like somewhere you're just thinking, oh my goodness me, and I can't even look out of the window. But I'm going to go out today with the inspiration of this conversation. I'm going to go out today with the boys. I'm going to start tackling some of it and reigniting my own momentum back in the garden, because spring is coming and hopefully the bulbs will come up, which is another reason why I plant bulbs, is because you don't have to do anything and they come back every year without, well, unless you've got loads of squirrels, they come back every year and it's job done, because it has to be as low maintenance as possible.
Thank you both. I saw also Arthur wanted to come in and respond to Kat's comments.
Okay, there are two things. I mean, and firstly, the kind of connectivity bit, and I've just remembered that my cousin's son, so my first cousin once removed, is not very well, and he retired early. And he started about COVID time to do his garden, and it was like I think you were describing. I mean, I'm quite fortunate. We've got an established garden. It's quite big, but his garden was a suburban garden, a new build with a square of lawn. And what I noticed was he got really enthusiastic, and it's someone I know, but I'm his cousin's. His mum's cousin. So, and we've always lived far apart. So, and he started to phone me up and said, "Oh, you know about this, Arthur? This stuff." And he phoned me up about what sort of greenhouse should I get, and then he's got an allotment as well. So he sends me a video walking around the allotment and saying, "This is what I'm doing," and then I counter that, not in a sort of, that sounds terrible, sort of an aggressive way, but in a way sort of say, he has got a plan. So he has long rows of onions, and he has 8 pots of a particular sort of chili and so on. Whereas I show him pictures of bees, and I wander around my garden and say, I think that's a leek I put in, and here is a nice insect that's sitting on it. That kind of idea. And yet normally, I suppose not normally, but in part of my mind, that would be someone, well, I don't think I ought to talk to you really much, because you've got one way of looking at it and I've got another way, and it's like sporting a different football team. But actually what's happened because of COVID, and we communicate via the mobile phone and send us each other pictures, is that he is becoming a little softer about his rows. He's being a bit more careful with pollinators and things. And I get quite a kick out of showing them that my parsnips were in a straight line this year. So that almost by default, we're like this connectedness. I think, it is a really important process of being connected to other people. And it has given me, because it's my extended family. So he now knows a bit more about my family, and I know a bit more about his, and so on and so forth. So that was one thing. And I suppose the other thing is to think about, I almost did some of this by proxy, because one of the neighbours is really keen, and he's been over a tub, 2 or 3 times a week in the summer taking photos, and I've felt that I could vicariously benefit from his activity. So I've got a link to him, and it's fine. And then now it's swapped, because he's a bit older and a bit less able to do the physical work, and I've been overdoing the physical work. And he's been enjoying me sending pictures about what I'm doing. And now he's going over because the flowers are exposed. And he can begin to see what insects are attracted by the celandines. So it's this kind of, I haven't got a plan. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm quite happy with the way you do your bit. But just listen to mine as well, and I'll listen to yours, and we'll both learn about it. And it feels really lovely, and on both a neighbourly but also on a family point of view, sort of like an extended link.
Thanks, Arthur. Louise?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's another really positive thing about nature and gardening and being involved and getting to know different people and different people's personalities. So I know that I've got a very sort of flexible view with how things are outside and in the garden, but I've got a picture in my head of how I'd love things to be. And my husband's especially over lockdown, over the last sort of like couple of years, has got really strongly into growing chilies. And Kat, you reminded me with your son growing chili plants. I mean, all of our windowsills inside the house are full of chili plants now. So the outside is a little bit more where I tend to just be able to get creative, but inside the house it's just full of chilies. So he's absolutely loved doing that. And it's just about that, as you were saying, Arthur, about having different ways of doing things and different perspectives on whether you've got a plan or not got a plan, and different ways of viewing that connection with nature in the outside. And everybody can do something in whichever way that they want to do it, and there's still ways to have fantastic conversations about it and be able to encourage people and support their way of doing things. And it's so full of vibrancy. It's nice to be involved in it.
Thanks, Louise. We all have different one words in our heads listening to this conversation, and I think the word organic appeared in mind because it's organic in terms of nature and gardening, but organic in terms of learning and development, and organic in terms of relationships and growth and connectivity. And talking about organic, there's also organic wind that is rustling in the background of Louise's house, because we're experiencing a bit of stormy weather today. So if you're wondering what that little rustle is, nature is coming in on the conversation. Unfortunately, we are now at the final minutes of this talk. Before I give my formal thanks and closing comments for this, I'm sure Sam wants to wrap us up with some further commentary. Sam
would love to wrap things up with more commentary, obviously. Yeah, I think I might be saying that this series seems to be doing this to me a lot recently. This is another conversation I don't want to end. I'm really, just enjoying exploring this whole idea of the role nature plays in our negotiation of relationships and our own kind of well-being, and that's all coming through. And I think the listeners will be able to hear that in the very kind of rich and articulate way that Arthur and Louise have been able to describe their journeys and their experiences. But I'm going to it's Arthur's fault because he's mentioned Heidegger, so I'm gonna I'm gonna channel my inner Heidegger here and say, well, actually, what I think we've been talking about here, and I actually think what we've been talking about largely through the podcast as a thing, as a way of negotiating the times that we're in, is this idea of daisying, the being in the world, and it's finding a way of being in the world. And there's no one way of doing that. We're talking about a similar phenomenon, Arthur, in terms of, gardening, the act of gardening or being in nature. But actually the experiences that you're having, while similar, are very different. And, negotiating ways of being in the world through reconnection, restoration, nurturing, all of these different kinds of acts of compassion and kindness are really, really coming to the fore. And I think it will resonate with many, the reconnection with nature that we've had through the last kind of 2 years. And, my experience is very similar to Louise's, in the sense that we live 400 yards away from, we live in a place called Pelton Fell. And, as the name would suggest, we're on a hill and everything else, but there's a woodland just there. I'm pointing now, just there. And we'd had no real kind of push to go and explore until lockdown. It was like, well, God, that's our walk. As Louise said, that was our walk. Turns out the place is absolutely massive, to the point where my son and I got lost one day and he was panicking because he didn't think we were going to make it home. That's how big the place is. We saw deer and we saw pheasants and this, and it's exactly that. It's the reconnection, and it's the being in the world. And I think that's what I've loved hearing most about your experiences and the different ways of being and the role that nature's played. So the whole idea of nature appreciation and the different ways that can play a role in our lives, our own well-being and the well-being of others, has been really, really interesting to hear about. So thank you for sharing.
Thanks, Sam. So thank you to our guests, Louise Mighall and Arthur Thurner. And thank you to our regular contributors, Kat Branch and Sam Elkington. Thank you, everybody, for a fascinating conversation. Thanks also go out to our wider podcast team, Julia Denman and Helke Ganostorje. And goodbye, everyone. Until next time, when we continue to talk about leisure, work and well-being, and what we can all do to engage with leisure seriously. Please like, subscribe. We have many more wonderful episodes and guests lined up for you in the coming months. Goodbye.